Alright, so let's back out here. We're going to go to loading screen. This is going to be the custom loading menu that we are going to design from scratch. Anytime you're in the canvas area or a layout, you can, we don't want the start menu, we don't want level 1 right now, we just want the loading screen. And you're going to bounce over to layer 0. We don't really need too many layers on this, so I'm just going to keep that the same. And we are going to change the color on that, of course. We don't really have to change anything else. All right. So you have your background, and if you double click anywhere, that's when you can start bringing up objects and stuff like that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sprite. Sprite is a common term for an image, if you will. It brings up this, which is kind of like a mini paint. And what you can do is you can draw stuff in here if you want, but a lot of times what I do is you'll open. I'm just going to go to my design. I'm going to pick the logo that I made. Excuse me. That's a little truth coming at you. Sorry, a little burp. And here you have pretty standard, image editing options. You got the rotate, you got the mirrors, you got stretch and skew, or resize, if you will, same thing. Background brightness, pretty standard stuff. And then one thing you'll have also is the image points. And this is basically your image points you can use for a lot of different things. You can use them to spawn, objects. For instance, if I wanted to use this to spawn objects, I could. So the origin, first of all, let me not get too ahead of myself. The origin is going to be the center of your image, basically. You can change this as you get more experience to be like assigned to the left or assigned to the right, assigned to the top. And what this does is it's kind of centering where your picture is pinned to. Like, for instance, you almost always want to center the origin of your images. That way, when you're designing them and you're putting them on a canvas, how they're organized or their position and all this good stuff is based on that origin point. So all the location and what have you is based on that. If you change this to the origin point to be left, that means the position and whatnot is based on that point. And so, for instance, if you're making a health bar, and I discovered this, if you have the origin point set to 0, and yet let's say you have the health, that wasn't a good way to explain that. You have it set to the middle, and you have the health bar basically decrease as you're taking damage. The health bar is going to stay centered, and the two edges are going to start shrinking down to the center point. And so instead, if you have this set to the left, what's going to happen is instead of it's shrinking on both ends, it's going to shrink from the right. I think that's correct. I could be wrong about that, but I think that was the example I had off the top of my head. But that's usually how those work out. Alternatively, you know what? Better example. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Better example would be maybe if you're anchoring. Anchor is a good word for it, but if you're anchoring a score or something like that, and the score gets bigger and bigger and bigger and longer and longer and longer, it's going to start shifting things out of. It's going to start shifting the position because it's based around that centered point. Whereas if you have it set to the left, it's going to be anchored right there, and it can only expand to the right. And so, yeah. And then image points you can use to do all sorts of things. Like you can have spawns trigger off an image point right here. You can have things are created off an image points. You can have something interact with an image point. Let's say you have a player, you have your player and you basically want them to, if they hit one of these image points, then something happens. You know what I mean? I don't know, it's kind of a bad example, but I usually use image points for spawning objects. For instance, a boss with multiple turrets, something like that. All right, so let's stick with the basics, even though I explained a bunch of crap. All right, so now we have the logo, and you'll notice it's kind of, it doesn't fit the screen. You can have it fit the screen. You can center it. You'll notice the position. I never like my positions to have decimals. And so I'm just going to move this around. And you'll notice since my origin is in the middle here, that my position, you'd almost expect your position to be at 0, 0, because up here is 0, 0. However, since it's in the middle, it's not 0, 0. But if you move it up here, you get closer to 0, 0. So again, that's kind of the relativity of that origin image point. Get rid of this. And I'm going to make this fit my screen, or my view. But you could have this change as well. Like I could probably throw, maybe a link to my website or something here as well. Or I could use this one instead and just have the website be part of the image. Alright, so I have the sprite in here, and you'll notice that now I can click on something and move it around. That is the sprite. And let's go to the anatomy of a sprite really quick. You have a name, so I'm just going to call this loading logo, if you will. Whether or not this is a global. So, okay, so usually what happens is when you start developing a game and you use all these layouts, as you change layouts, things get on the old layout get destroyed. And so global is a way to get around that. And that's why when you use like a variable, more often than not, you use a global variable instead of instance variables. However, you can use instance variables as well, or local variables. And that's one important thing is having, even though Construct 2 touts that you can pretty much do a lot of stuff without coding. If you have a coding background, it really helps a lot. And math as well. Because you get into things like variables and you'll start doing writing functions and doing calculations and arrays and all sorts of stuff like that. It's a lot harder to get unless you have that kind of background. In my experience, anyway. Either that, I'm just an idiot. Okay, let's go back to turn off my AC really quick. Okay, so anatomy of sprite. You have your name, global, which layer it's on. As you start making more and more objects, this will be important because sometimes you'll put a sprite on the wrong layer and you gotta move it around. Angle, pretty basic. Opacity is what we're gonna kind of mess with. I think there's a different setting that we can use too, but you can use opacity. Position, size, blah, blah, blah. Instance variables, this is basically a local variable, which means it's only applicable to this sprite. So for instance, if we had this sprite on if we went to the next layout, this sprite wouldn't exist, this variable doesn't exist. You can name it whatever you want, whether or not you want it to be Boolean, which is true false. You can be a number, which you can pretty much use almost as a true false anyway, if you just use 0 or 1. Text, the same thing. It's just a variable. So it's up for grabs on however you want to use it. Behaviors. Behaviors give you some cool things. For instance, the solid behavior you would use a lot in a platform game when you're jumping on things and whatnot. The scroll to behavior, you're always going to have your screen scrolling to the player, right? So that's what's going to cause your screen to move with the player. Flash could be important. We could use fade here. I might use fade here instead of using my old method, because originally I designed a method that would use basically every tick opacity would increase to 100% or by 1 to 100%. At 100% it triggers a variable or a local variable, and then it triggers to shut that down and go back to 0. And I think you can do fade. I think fade can do that as well. So a bunch of stuff. A direction, to control player. Bullet also can be used to control player. Carves, pretty interesting. Platform obviously is used a lot of times in platform games. You can, use a turret if you have some kind of defense type of deal. I am actually gonna, yeah, whoops. I am going to, I'm gonna use fade on this. We're gonna see how that works instead of going back to my old coding. Okay, so once you add a behavior, then it opens up options. Not all the time, because sometimes the options aren't controlled in here, but they're controlled in the event sheet. So you want whether or not you want the fade to be active on start. I do, I think. Let's see, fade in time. Let's see, fade, blah, 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 blah. Alright, so for duration in seconds, a fade in or 0 to skip. Oh, so I'm gonna have to play with this before between fade in and fade out. Okay. Oh, I got you. Let's set this at 5, and we're gonna set this at 5, and then I'm just gonna run it. We're gonna see how it looks. The wait time, we'll have it set to 1 second, and destroy after fade out. That's important because that'll do some object cleanliness for you. Okay, so back to that, or we'll look at that in a minute. Effects give you almost the same option as layer effects. So we looked at that a little bit earlier. I don't use them too often. It's really when you're wanting to do something funky. Container, whether or not you want to have a container with this object and another object. This may get more into use, for instance, a player and a player container, because generally you'll have a player, or I'll describe this backwards or what have you, but you'll have a player, and then that's going to be the thing that moves around. But on top of that, you're going to have the animation box or an animation container or what have you, to where that's going to be, okay, if I'm moving, what does it look like? The animation is just going to pin on top of it, so it's actually the animation itself is not interacting with things like the environment. It's the player box or the player container. Because what can happen is when you're designing an animation, and collisions come into play. Edges of animations, and depending on how it's moving, the player's moving around, it can easily get caught on things like a ledge, and then your player's just stuck because like a piece of hair or something like that. Okay. Properties, animations, blah blah blah. Yeah, we got there already. Oh, I didn't describe that yet. Whether or not we want that to be initially visible, the initial animation, we'll talk about that in a minute. And initial frame and collisions enabled. Collisions enabled is important. For this, we don't need it because it's just a loading screen. It's always important to keep collisions off as much as possible unless you need them. Unless it's something like you have bullets, colliding with an enemy and the enemy needs to be destroyed, the bullet needs to be destroyed, etc. Or vice versa if enemies firing on you. You'll need collisions enabled. You don't necessarily need them, but it's one of the biggest things about games is collision detection and stuff like that. Let's open this again. I'm going to show you different properties of Sprite. So here you have animations. Okay, so technically, and you have animation frames. So we do use this to animate things. So for instance, a player will have a player sprite strip, and they'll have like 30 animations here, or maybe 10, or it'll be a collection of like 30 total. And then you'll have different animations here for like walking. You'll have one for, standing. And so your player, while they're standing, let's say no arrow keys are being hit, while they're standing, their animations are just going to be playing whatever's here. And usually it's just a simple standing one. But if they're walking, they're holding down like the right arrow or something like that. There will be an animation, maybe 5 or 6 pictures to where it'll show their feet on, this one it's going to be standing, this one their foot's going to be barely moving forward, this one the foot's going to be moving forward. Here it's going to be stomping down, and then it's going to keep going and going to really look like they're walking. So that's usually what animation is it's a collection of a lot of pictures. All right, so we don't need that here. And you can call on these different animations when you use event sheets. So by default, they don't all just work together and stuff like that. You have to make sure that when X happens, Y happens. Okay, well, when X stops, what is going to happen then? You know, what's it going to look like? How's it going to revert back to the original, or what? You know, what should it look like now? So anyway, animations, and then over here we have the speed that you want to play the animation, whether or not you want to loop it, repeat it. Ping pong can alternatively reverse that. I've never actually used that. So it's just a little bit of anatomy of an animation. So we have fade running, and should take 5 seconds to fade in. It's gonna pause a second and then fade out 5 seconds and then destroy, and then that's all it's gonna do right now. Let's see if this works. I don't know. It's gonna open up with Chrome. Yeah, you'll see that does work. Now, one thing I recommend is if you are designing and you want to preview things over and over again, just keep Chrome open. So that way it just opens a new tab instead of opening Chrome from scratch again. It gets annoying. It's slow. So you can see the fade in works. Pause. And the fade out. Now that takes probably way too long. I don't really need a wait time for that. Shrink that, drop that to 3, drop that to 3, and then we're going to test what that looks like. Not too bad, not too bad. So I'll stick that with that for now. And hit the Control S, sorry. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go with sounds. And I'm going to import a sound. And it's already selected to my design because I had to organize all these assets or else I'd be going all over the freaking place. And the wolf house sound that I pulled. And this is going to be interesting. And when you're importing sounds, you'll get into dealing with sound quality, obviously, but also different formats, audio formats. And again, if you don't have experience with some of this stuff, you know, it's touted as being, oh, just make your own games. You don't need coding and stuff like that. But if, like, for instance, if you're not familiar with audio files and differences of that, it's going to be a little rougher. But I don't think too many people would be messing with this if they didn't have some of that, because audio files are more and more basic. If you need to manipulate audio files, I recommend using Audacity, and that's what I use. So pause here. Pause. Okay, sorry, take a break there. All right, so sometimes you'll get an error here if it's has a weird format. So this all looks good. I usually don't mess with this stuff too much. 96K seems to be good. Obviously, the bigger file size you put in, excuse me, the longer it's going to take to load. So you don't need, well, for a mobile game, maybe you don't want like a full-on orchestra. Unless you're, you know, Square Enix, and they just make great music. Alright, B-room. Or the orchestra they do uses it, that they use anyway. Okay, so I have the sound now, and I think I can play this. Yep. Oh, VLC, because I haven't used VLC since I loaded this user. And so that's the wolf house sound. Yeah, just played it twice, but whatever. All right, so by default, nothing's happening with this. When we load this, I mean, nothing happens. So in order to actually use this, we got to program an event sheet. So, one thing you're going to need to do is you're going to have to double click in the canvas area or in the layout area, and you're going to have to add audio. So in order for anything to work, you have to add audio. Now, once you add audio to, you'll see this little thing right here. Some of these objects, when you add them once, they'll add it to the entire project. So you don't have to add it to each layer. And that's more along to the things like inputs, you know, that kind of thing. We'll need inputs, so it's recommended that you add keyboard and you add mouse and touch now, just because you'll probably need it eventually. Gamepad I usually refrain from right now. However, you can post the Xbox Store or Xbox Live, if you will. So using gamepads will be well. I use a gamepad for my PC too. So um, yeah, storage. So the only thing that's really local, I think, are going to be things like this. Well, yeah, stuff like that. Potentially media. So added audio, and so what's going to happen now is we're going to make an event, and this is going to be what's going to happen. So what I want this, I usually code things to be as super tight as possible. Um, and so what's going to happen, I'm going to have on starter layout, and I am actually going to add, oops, oh, that always gets in the way at first. Let me back out of here so you can see what I did again. Right click, add another condition, go into system, and I'm going to compare two values because they don't have an option for this. And what I'm going to compare is you can go into the system again, pick a bunch of these. Now, one thing they don't have in the basic layout or the basic options is layout name. And like things like go to layout and stuff like that, they have a drop down where you can pick the layout name, but here you have to define it. So I'm going to choose layout name equals loading. And so on starter layout, it's only going to trigger if this layout name equals loading. So it's not going to trigger on any of these, or else I'd have the howling noise trigger every time. And what we're going to do is we're going to audio, and we're going to play the wolf howl sound, not looping. Volume's going to stick at 0. You can turn it down and up. Like for instance, on another game I have, some sounds are so constant that you don't really want them overwhelming everything. Like for instance, firing a gun or something like that. So maybe you want to set this to -10, so it's slightly quieter than maybe the background music, or vice versa. You want the background music to be quieter. And the tag is optional, but it becomes important, for instance, if you want to control all sounds at once. For instance, I think there is not an easy option to, when you're pausing a game, to stop the sound, and then when you unpause the game to revert it back to what it was. There's not just a pause all and resume all. I'm pretty sure there's not. It specifically pause which sound and resume which sound. However, you can pause and resume based on tags, and so that's what allows you to get around that. So instead of pausing one, you can pause one collective tag and then resume one collective tag and stuff like that. So I'm just going to make this loading. Yeah, don't really even need it. And so now at starter layout, when it's loading, blah, 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 it's going to play this. So let's see if this works. And we'll see it works. And at this point in time, nothing's happening. So it's perfect. So that did work. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do, I do not have this saved yet, and I can't believe I went this long without asking you to save. You're going to want to save as a project. You can save as a single file if you want. I usually save as a project because eventually when you're actually developing this to do something with it, you're going to have access to all the sub files and folders and stuff like that, whereas a single file you won't. However, this is also more portable to keep in mind. So I'm going to save as a project, and let us just go under Norton Studios. I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it Patreon. Norton Patreon, right? I have to think of a cooler name. I haven't decided what I'm going to make this to be. I think it's going to be a platformer, because I want to make I have a couple ideas that I can't talk too much about, but I'm sure everybody else has had the same ones. It's just when you think about it, it's always, oh, I can't tell anybody about it until it's awesome and developed. All right, so I saved it, all that good stuff. And up here, I'll go through some of these options in a minute. So we have all that. Let's go ahead and mess with the start menu, and then we'll stop. Well, let's see how far along I am. So again, the start menu, it's a pretty basic menu, so it does not need to be super large in layout size. I always match it to to the actual window. Now, level one, you are going to make sure it's a lot bigger than the view size because this is going to be your bread and butter of your game, or at least one of them, one of the levels. Um, because what's for loading in the start menu? What's the point of having the bigger layout if you can't see anything on it? You know what I mean? You're not going to interact with it. So start menu. Let's go ahead and throw some text on here. I'm just going to call this basic stuff like Norton Patreon. Usually this is going to be your start. And let's make this not centered. Well, I like to do that too, but usually centered horizontally. So that way you can start basing it off like that. And sometimes it's a pain in the ass to get things centered. So if you ever wanted to, you could do stuff like that to make sure it's almost absolutely centered. However, you do run the risk of having your object being so long that it gets annoying or gets in the way. So we have a text object title. I'm going to call this. So this is important. Every time you create a new object like a text or sprite, it's just going to call it sprite 1, sprite 2, sprite 3, and you will never remember that which one is which. So nowadays, what I like to do is I'll even maybe start aligning them to the layout that they're in. You know, start menu title, and it could even be text. Because eventually, for instance, one thing we're doing right now, you can consider we're making just placeholders. Because in a final game, you might not want just text like this. You might want like a badass design or some kind of logo. So for now, it's just going to be placeholder. We're going to call it text, and I could add another one in here, which will actually be the title, and maybe it'll be title sprite. But keeping them defined as accurately as possible is important. All right, so with the start menu, um, we actually have a couple options now. By default, we just have a couple layers. Let's go ahead and add some layers. So layer 0 is still your background, which is perfect. So let's go and label this. And you can do this each like for the first couple layouts that you make, but once you get into the bulk of your layouts, a lot of times what you're going to want to make sure that you do, or in my experience, is do not start duplicating these until you know you're ready. Make sure you have all of your layers that you want, because if you want to add another layer on, later on, you might be able to use the global setting, or it will make it work. However, it could kind of get in your way if you start duplicating too early. I did that before, and then later on I'm like, I don't want to make this new layer. I want to make this new design. I want this to function this way. I wish I would have copied it before, because now I gotta kind of do more work than I had to originally. So start menu, we got the background, and you know what? I always like dark background. Unfortunately, that hides our text. I am too big of a fan of black and red, so there we go. Get our background, and right now the title's on the background. That's kind of okay, because more to the point, what I made these for are things like menu or credits. So what we'll have is we'll have the background with, the play button, all that good stuff, start, maybe resume. Your menu will be where you can click a menu and bring up maybe difficulty, bring up maybe a high score, something like that. And then your credits is going to be where you bring up something to thank people who have kind of helped and stuff like that, or shout outs and what have you. So the background we can stick here. We got our title. Let's make a play button. Pretty basic. Again, we're just doing placeholders, so a lot of times I'll just do this. Origin usually will stay the same, so you got here, and let's call this start menu play. And so at this point, a lot of times what I'll do, when you make new objects and stuff like that, they always go here. And you have the option of making subfolders for, like, for instance, the start menu if you wanted to, or levels. I started doing this more and more once your game gets pretty big with how many different levels you're making and stuff like that. You'll have a lot of objects to organize, and it can be a pain in the ass. So start menu play, and so here, something I'll do to maybe shorten things up, I'll just clone it. Let's see, start menu, just drag it over, boom, it's right there. Then clone, start menu, credits, boom. And what else could we design here? Well, the sprite right here in the middle, and the sprite is going to be like pretty much our cool animation. Like for instance, you have your logo. Like for instance, let's say we're designing a nerdy Dungeons and Dragons game type of dealio, like I love. Um, you know, have your option, you have your buttons here, and here you have like a picture of a long ass, you know, a long ass dragon, a long dragon, um, and that kind of thing. So you could have that here, and again, placeholders. You don't need to make perfect at the start. You just need to make what you have perfect is in your mind or something. Alright, so I'm just being annoying right now. Moving that crap around. Let's see. And, okay, so we got that. We got all this good stuff. And so nothing is existing on these yet. Okay. And so here we have start menu play. Blah, blah, blah. Start menu credits. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is now we have the next layout that we want to go to. So,